Martin's Grill is on the brink of closing, and its owner, Ed Martin, is struggling to keep the family legacy alive. Just as he's about to lose hope, a mysterious stranger walks into the restaurant on a cold winter night. Who is this man, and why does he seem so familiar with the world of fine dining? Could this unexpected encounter be the turning point Ed so desperately needs? In this heartwarming story about resilience, community, and the unexpected twists of fate, the answers are never as simple as they seem. What will become of Martin's Grill? And who will be there to help Ed when he needs it most? Dive into the story and discover how a small town, a struggling restaurant, and a chance meeting might just hold the keys to a brighter future. But be prepared. This tale is filled with questions that will keep you guessing until the very end. Part 1. A Night of Hopes. The winter evening settled over the small town of Red River, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. The town, which had once been a bustling hub of activity, now lay quiet under a thick blanket of snow, the only sounds coming from the occasional crunch of footsteps on the frozen sidewalks or the distant hum of a passing car. It was a night like many others in recent months, cold, still, and eerily silent. In the heart of this quiet town stood Martin's Grill, a family-owned restaurant that had been a cornerstone of the community for generations. Its neon sign flickered slightly, casting a soft, welcoming glow that seemed almost out of place in the deserted streets. Inside, the restaurant was nearly empty, the tables set with the precision of routine rather than expectation. The once bustling dining room now held only a few scattered patrons, their hushed conversations blending into the background hum of the heater. Ed Martin stood behind the counter, absently polishing a glass as he stared out the front window. The snowflakes danced in the dim light, falling slowly and steadily, as if in no hurry to reach the ground. Ed's reflection in the window revealed a man in his mid-40s, with deep lines etched into his face from years of hard work and worry. His dark hair, now flecked with gray, was neatly combed back, and his blue eyes, once bright with ambition, were clouded with concern. Martin's Grill had been Ed's life for as long as he could remember. His parents had opened the restaurant when he was just a child, and he had grown up within its walls, learning the ropes from his father in the kitchen and his mother in the front of the house. The restaurant had been a second home, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. The restaurant was struggling, and Ed was running out of options. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 8 p.m., and Ed knew it was almost time to close up for the night. He glanced around the empty dining room, taking in the faded red booths, the worn wooden tables, and the photographs that lined the walls. The pictures told the story of the restaurant's history: black and white photos of his parents on opening day, snapshots of Ed as a young boy helping in the kitchen, and more recent images of happy customers enjoying meals with friends and family. It was a legacy that Ed had always been proud of, but now that pride was tinged with fear. How much longer can I keep this up? He wondered, setting the glass down on the counter with a sigh. The bills were piling up, and the number of customers had dwindled to a trickle. The town had changed over the years, with new businesses popping up and old ones closing their doors for good. Fast food chains and trendy eateries had siphoned off much of the local clientele, leaving Martin's Grill to rely on a shrinking base of loyal regulars. But even they were coming in less frequently, their absence like a slow drain on Ed's hope. He had tried everything he could think of to keep the restaurant afloat: special promotions, updating the menu, even reaching out to the local paper for a feature article. But nothing seemed to make a difference. The days dragged on, each one a little quieter than the last, and Ed found himself wondering if it was time to admit defeat. The thought of closing the doors for good filled him with a deep sense of loss, as if he were on the verge of losing a part of himself. As Ed began to tidy up the counter, the bell above the door jingled softly, signaling a late-night visitor. He looked up, surprised to see someone coming in so close to closing time. A man stood in the doorway, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. He was bundled up in a worn coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, and a knit cap pulled low over his ears. Snow clung to his shoulders and the brim of his hat, and his breath puffed out in small clouds as he stepped inside. "Evening," Ed called out, setting aside the rag he'd been using to wipe down the counter. He offered the newcomer a welcoming smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can I help you with something?" The man hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. His eyes scanned the empty dining room, taking in the cozy decor and the faint scent of simmering stew that lingered in the air. Finally, he looked back at Ed, his expression guarded but polite. "I was wondering if I could get something to eat," the man said, his voice rough and low, as if unused to speaking. "Just something small. I don't have much money, but I can pay what I can." Ed's gaze dropped to the man's hands, which were clutching a few crumpled dollar bills. The sight of those worn-out bills, combined with the man's thin, weather-beaten appearance, stirred something in Ed's chest, an ache of empathy that he hadn't felt in a long time. This man, whoever he was, looked like he had seen better days, much like Ed himself. But there was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of pride that hadn't yet been beaten down by whatever hardships he had endured. Without a second thought, Ed waved away the money. "No need to pay," he said gently. "Dinner's on the house. Have a seat, and I'll bring you something warm." The man blinked in surprise, his grip on the crumpled bills loosening slightly. For a moment, it seemed as if he might argue, but then he nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ed watched as the man made his way to a booth near the window, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were unsure whether he was really welcome. As he slid into the booth, Ed couldn't help but notice how the man's eyes lingered on the photographs that lined the walls. There was a familiarity in the way he looked at them, as if he were searching for something, or perhaps someone he had lost. Shaking off his curiosity, Ed headed back into the kitchen. He could feel the cold seeping in through the thin walls, but the warmth of the stove and the smell of the simmering stew brought a sense of comfort. Ed had always found solace in cooking, in the simple act of preparing a meal for someone else. It was a way of connecting with others, of sharing a piece of himself through the food he made. As he ladled the beef stew into a bowl, Ed thought about his father. The stew was one of his father's recipes, a dish that had been a staple at Martin's Grill for decades. It was hearty and filling, made with tender chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions, all slow-cooked in a rich, savory broth. Ed had learned how to make it when he was just a boy, standing on a stool next to his father at the stove, watching as he carefully added each ingredient with the precision of a craftsman. Those were good memories, memories that Ed held onto tightly in these uncertain times. His father had always believed that food was more than just sustenance. It was a way of bringing people together, of creating a sense of community. Ed had tried to carry on that tradition, even as the world around him changed. With the stew ready, Ed placed a thick slice of freshly baked bread on the side of the plate and carried it out to the dining room. The man was sitting quietly in the booth, his hands clasped together on the table as he stared out the window at the falling snow. There was a stillness about him, a sense of quiet contemplation that made Ed hesitate for a moment before approaching. "Here you go," Ed said, setting the plate down in front of the man. "I hope you like it. It's one of our specialties." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Ed's for the first time. There was something in his gaze, something that Ed couldn't quite put his finger on. It was a mixture of gratitude and surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to show him kindness. "Thank you," the man said again, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "This is more than I expected." Ed smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "It's no trouble at all. Everyone deserves a good meal, especially on a night like this." The man nodded, his gaze dropping to the steaming bowl of stew in front of him. He picked up the spoon, hesitating for just a moment before taking a small, cautious bite. Ed watched as the man's expression softened, the tension in his shoulders easing as the warmth of the food began to spread through him. "This is incredible," the man murmured, almost to himself, as he took another bite. "It reminds me of home." Ed's smile widened, though it was bittersweet. "That's what we aim for here, a little taste of home." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional clink of the spoon against the bowl and the faint hum of the heater. Ed felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if the presence of this stranger had somehow lifted some of the weight from his shoulders. It was a small thing, offering a meal to someone in need, but it felt significant in a way that Ed couldn't quite explain. As the man continued to eat, Ed found himself growing more curious about him. There was something about this stranger that intrigued him, something in the way he carried himself, in the quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his worn appearance. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Ed asked after a while, unable to shake the feeling that this man needed more than just a meal. The man paused, setting down his spoon as he considered the question. "Not really," he admitted, his voice soft. "I've been moving around, trying to find a place that feels right, you know? But it's been hard." Ed nodded, understanding all too well what it meant to search for something that seemed just out of reach. "You're welcome to stay here for a bit if you need to warm up. I'm closing up soon, but there's no rush." The man looked at him, his gaze searching. For a moment, Ed thought he might refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of gratitude. "That's very kind of you." "It's no trouble," Ed replied, waving off the thanks. "Just make yourself comfortable. I'll be in the back if you need anything." As Ed turned to head back into the kitchen, the man spoke again, his voice stopping Ed in his tracks. "This place, it's got a lot of history, doesn't it?" Ed paused, glancing back at the man. There was a hint of nostalgia in his voice, as if he could feel the weight of the years that had passed through these walls. "Yeah," Ed replied, his voice tinged with pride. "It's been in my family for generations. My parents ran it before me, and their parents before them. It's been my life's work, but, well, times are tough." The man nodded slowly, as if he understood the weight of those words. "You know, it's rare to find a place like this anymore. So many people have forgotten what it means to cook from the heart, to make food that's more than just something to fill the stomach. What you've got here, it's special." Ed felt a lump form in his throat at the unexpected praise. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken about his restaurant with such sincerity. "I appreciate that," Ed said, his voice thick with emotion. "Really, I do. But I'm not sure how much longer I can keep it going." The man didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be deep in thought, his gaze distant as he stared down at the remnants of his meal. Finally, he looked up at Ed, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Maybe what you need isn't just customers, but someone who sees the value in what you're doing here. Someone who can help you find a way to keep it alive." Ed looked at him, puzzled by the sudden shift in the conversation. "What do you mean?" The man set down his spoon and leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "I wasn't always like this, you know. I used to be someone important in the food world. I know people who could help. If you're willing to trust me, I think I can do something to turn things around for you." For a moment, Ed was stunned into silence. The idea that this man, who had walked in off the street looking for a free meal, might have connections in the culinary world seemed unbelievable. But there was something in the man's eyes, a seriousness that made Ed pause. "Why would you want to help me?" Ed asked, still trying to process what he was hearing. The man sighed, looking down at his hands. "Because someone once did the same for me. I had lost everything, just like you. But a stranger showed me kindness when I least expected it. It saved my life, in more ways than one. Maybe this is my chance to pay it forward." Ed didn't know what to say. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, but this man was a mystery. Yet, Something in his words resonated deeply with Ed. It was as if fate had brought them together at this critical moment, offering one last chance at redemption. "All right," Ed said finally, a tentative smile forming on his lips. "I don't know if I believe in miracles, but I've got nothing to lose at this point. Let's see what we can do." The man smiled back, a genuine expression of hope and determination. "You won't regret it. I promise." As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in a peaceful silence, Ed felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a future for Martin's Grill. And maybe this unlikely stranger was the key to unlocking it. As Ed watched the stranger enjoy the meal, a sense of quiet satisfaction filled him. This small act of kindness, though simple, felt like a connection to something larger. The night had been full of surprises, and Ed couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow might bring. Could this unexpected encounter be the beginning of something new for Martin's Grill? What do you think will happen next? Do you believe in the power of kindness to change lives? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Part 2. The Taste of Kindness. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the town covered in a thick, white blanket. Ed arrived at the restaurant early, his mind still reeling from the conversation with the man the night before. He hadn't expected much when he first sat down to talk to him, but there was a sincerity in the stranger's offer that Ed couldn't shake. He busied himself in the kitchen, preparing for the day ahead. Though the restaurant didn't usually see much traffic until lunchtime, Ed wanted to be ready. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if something important was about to happen. At around 10 a.m., just as Ed was finishing up a batch of freshly baked bread, the doorbell jingled. Wiping his hands on his apron, he stepped out of the kitchen and was surprised to see the same man from the night before standing in the doorway. This time, however, he wasn't alone. "Morning, Ed," the man greeted with a smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought someone with me." Behind him stood a well-dressed woman in her mid-30s, carrying a leather-bound notebook. She had an air of professionalism about her, and when she smiled at Ed, it was with the kind of warmth that immediately put him at ease. "This is Claire," the man continued. "She's a food writer, one of the best in the business. I thought she might be interested in what you've got here." Claire stepped forward and extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Martin. I've heard wonderful things about your restaurant." Ed shook her hand, still feeling a bit overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "It's nice to meet you too, but I'm not sure what you've heard. We're just a small place, nothing fancy." Claire smiled, her eyes glinting with curiosity. "Sometimes, it's the small places that have the most heart. I've been writing about food for a long time, and I've found that the best meals often come from places like yours, where the food is made with love and care." Ed couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at her words. He had always believed in the power of good, honest cooking, and it was comforting to hear that someone else appreciated that too. "Well, I'd be happy to show you around," Ed offered. "It's not much, but this place means the world to me." As he led them through the restaurant, showing off the kitchen, the dining area, and the small but well-stocked pantry, Ed found himself opening up to these two strangers. He talked about the history of the restaurant, how his parents had started it with nothing but a dream and a lot of hard work, and how he had taken over after they passed away. He spoke of the challenges he'd faced, the highs and lows, and the struggles to keep the doors open in an increasingly competitive market. Claire listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. The man, who had introduced himself as Rick, chimed in occasionally, offering insights and ideas. There was something reassuring about their presence, as if they were genuinely invested in helping Ed succeed. After the tour, Claire sat down with Ed at one of the tables and opened her notebook. "So, Ed," she began, "I'd like to write a piece about Martin's Grill. Something that captures the essence of what makes this place special. I think people need to hear your story." Ed was taken aback. He had never expected his little restaurant to be the subject of a feature article. That would be amazing, he said, still trying to process what was happening. But why? There are so many other places out there, bigger and more popular. Why focus on us? Claire smiled softly. Because your story is worth telling. It's about more than just food. It's about resilience, tradition, and the power of community. People are looking for that now more than ever. And besides, she added with a wink, I've heard your food is pretty incredible. Ed couldn't help but chuckle. Well, I do my best. I just hope it lives up to the hype. I have no doubt it will, Claire said confidently. How about we start with that beef stew you mentioned? I'd love to try it. Ed nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. This was his chance to show them what Martin's Grill was all about. He headed back into the kitchen, his mind racing as he prepared the dish. Everything had to be perfect, not just for Claire and Rick, but for the future of the restaurant. As the stew simmered on the stove, filling the kitchen with its rich, savory aroma, Ed felt a sense of calm wash over him. Cooking had always been his way of expressing himself, a way to connect with others through the simple act of sharing a meal. This was what he loved most, and he was determined to pour every ounce of that love into the dish. When it was ready, Ed carefully plated the stew, adding a slice of the fresh-baked bread on the side. He carried the plate out to the dining area, where Claire and Rick were waiting expectantly. Claire took the first bite, her eyes closing as she savored the flavors. For a moment, the room was silent, and Ed held his breath, waiting for her reaction. When she finally opened her eyes, there was a look of pure delight on her face. This is fantastic, she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. It's everything I hoped it would be, and more. Ed felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. Thank you, he said simply, his heart swelling with gratitude. Rick, who had been quietly observing, nodded in agreement. You've got something special here, Ed. People need to know about it. Claire spent the rest of the morning interviewing Ed, asking him about his cooking philosophy, his favorite memories from the restaurant, and his hopes for the future. By the time they finished, Ed felt as though he had shared a piece of his soul with these two strangers. But instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, he felt hopeful, like he had finally found someone who understood and appreciated what he was trying to do. Before they left, Claire handed Ed her card. I'll be in touch once the article is ready. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Ed watched them leave, a sense of possibility blooming in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a future for Martin's Grill, a future that was worth fighting for. Part 3. A Twist of Fate. A few weeks passed, and life at Martin's Grill slowly began to change. It started with a few new customers, people who had heard about the restaurant through word of mouth or had seen a mention of it online. Then, one morning, Ed woke up to find his phone buzzing with notifications. Claire's article had been published, and it was making waves in the food community. The piece was everything Ed could have hoped for and more. Claire had captured the essence of Martin's Grill, the warmth, the history, the love that went into every dish. She had written about Ed's journey, his struggles, and his unwavering dedication to keeping his family's legacy alive. And she had done it in a way that made people want to come and experience it for themselves. The response was overwhelming. Within days, the restaurant was buzzing with activity. Locals who had long since stopped coming were returning, eager to rediscover the flavors they had once loved. New faces appeared at the door, drawn by the promise of a meal that was more than just food. It was an experience, a connection to something deeper. Ed found himself busier than he had been in years, but it was the kind of busy that filled him with energy rather than draining it. Every day, he woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, excited to greet the customers and share with them the dishes that had been passed down through generations. And it wasn't just the local community that was taking notice. Claire's article had caught the attention of several well-known food bloggers and critics who began visiting the restaurant and sharing their experiences online. The buzz around Martin's Grill grew, and soon, Ed was fielding calls from journalists, food shows, and even a few investors who were interested in helping him expand. But through it all, Ed remained focused on what mattered most: the food, the customers, and the spirit of hospitality that had always been at the heart of the restaurant. He wasn't interested in becoming the next big thing. He just wanted to continue doing what he loved and to share that love with others. One evening, as Ed was closing up after another busy day, Rick walked in. He hadn't seen him since that morning with Claire, and Ed was surprised to see him now, especially after all that had happened. "Rick." Ed greeted him with a warm smile. "What brings you back? I thought you might be off helping someone else by now." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "I've been keeping an eye on things from a distance, but I wanted to come by and see how you were doing. Looks like you've been pretty busy." "You could say that," Ed replied, gesturing to the tables that had been full just a few hours earlier. "I can't thank you enough, Rick. If it wasn't for you and Claire, I don't know where I'd be right now." Rick smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You did the hard work, Ed. We just helped you get the recognition you deserve. But I'm glad to see the place thriving." Ed nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's been incredible. I never imagined things would turn around like this. But there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Rick raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" "That night when you came in," Ed began, choosing his words carefully. "Why did you decide to help me? You didn't know me anything. Why go out of your way for a stranger?" Rick was silent for a moment, as if weighing his response. Finally, he sighed, his gaze distant. "I guess it's because I saw a little of myself in you, Ed. I was once in a similar situation. Everything I'd worked for was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. But someone stepped in and helped me, showed me that there was still hope. It changed my life, and I've always felt like I owed it to them, and to myself, to do the same for someone else when the time came." Ed listened quietly, the weight of Rick's words sinking in. He had always known there was more to Rick's story than he had let on, but hearing it now, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and connection. "Well, I'm glad you did," Ed said softly. "You've given me more than just a second chance. You've given me a reason to keep going." Rick smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "That's all I wanted, Ed. To give you the chance to keep doing what you love. And from what I can see, you're doing just that." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the hum of the kitchen the only sound in the room. Finally, Rick stood up, offering Ed a hand. "I should get going, but I'll be around. Don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything." Ed shook his hand firmly, his grip conveying the depth of his gratitude. "Thank you, Rick, for everything." Rick nodded and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Ed. "You know, Ed, the world needs more places like Martin's Grill. Places that remind us of what really matters. Good food, good people, and a little kindness. Keep that alive, and you'll never have to worry about this place closing again." With that, Rick left, disappearing into the night, leaving Ed standing alone in the quiet restaurant. But this time, the quiet didn't feel so empty. Instead, it was filled with the echoes of laughter, conversation, and the promise of many more busy days to come. Part 4, A New Dawn. The weeks turned into months, and the success of Martin's Grill continued to grow. The restaurant had become a beloved fixture in the community once more, a place where people came not just for the food, but for the sense of warmth and belonging that Ed and his team worked so hard to cultivate. Ed had expanded the menu, adding new dishes inspired by his family's recipes and his own creative twists. He had even started hosting cooking classes on weekends, sharing his passion for food with others and passing on the skills that had been handed down to him. The restaurant had also become a gathering place for the community, hosting events, fundraisers, and celebrations. It was a place where people came to connect, to share stories, and to create memories. And through it all, Ed remained at the center, greeting each customer with a smile and a heartfelt welcome. But despite all the success, Ed never forgot the lessons he had learned during those dark days. He knew that it wasn't just about the food or the business, it was about the people, the connections he had made, the lives he had touched, and the kindness that had been shown to him had made all the difference. One afternoon, as Ed was preparing for the evening rush, he received a letter in the mail. It was from Rick, who had been traveling around the country, helping other struggling restaurants find their footing. The letter was brief, but it brought a smile to Ed's face. "Ed, I've been following your progress, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. You've turned Martin's Grill into something truly special, a place where people can come and feel at home. I knew you had it in you, and you've proven me right. Keep up the good work, and remember, kindness goes a long way. All the best. Rick." Ed folded the letter and tucked it into his apron pocket, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. Rick's words were a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had to be grateful for. As the evening crowd began to fill the restaurant, Ed looked around at the smiling faces, the laughter, and the warm glow of the lights reflecting off the snow outside. This was what he had always dreamed of, a place where people could come together, share a meal, and feel like they were part of something bigger. And as he moved through the dining room, greeting customers, checking on the kitchen, and making sure everything was running smoothly, Ed knew that Martin's Grill was more than just a restaurant. It was a testament to the power of resilience, community, and the simple act of kindness. No matter what the future held, Ed was ready to face it, knowing that he had the support of his community and the strength to keep moving forward. The restaurant, once on the brink of closing, was now a thriving symbol of hope, and Ed couldn't have been prouder of what they had built together. As the night drew to a close and the last customer left, Ed turned off the lights and locked the door. He stood for a moment, looking out at the snowy street, feeling the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. There was still work to be done, challenges to face, but Ed knew that he wasn't alone. With a smile, he turned and walked into the night, ready to embrace whatever came next. Because at Martin's Grill, the best was yet to come. Martin's Grill had found its place once again, not just in the town, but in the hearts of everyone who walked through its doors. Ed had learned that sometimes, when you least expect it, life offers you a second chance. And all it takes is a little kindness to set things in motion. Thank you for joining me on this journey. How did Ed's story resonate with you? Do you have any suggestions for future stories or thoughts on what could happen next at Martin's Grill? Let's keep the conversation going. Leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with all my upcoming tales.